It's Friday, January 12th, 1979. Across Chicago, people wake up to weather reports that feel almost routine. A winter storm is coming. Sure, it's January in the Midwest. They've weathered these before. The city had other things on its mind. In 9 days, Super Bowl 13 would arrive. The Pittsburgh Steelers and the Dallas Cowboys, the biggest game of the year. Fans were already talking about it. Hotels were filling up. The anticipation hummed through the loop, through the neighborhoods, through every bar and deli from the South Side to Rogers Park. But the forecast was changing, quietly. By Friday morning, meteorologists were updating their predictions. Not 2 to 4 inches anymore. Something bigger was coming, something that would turn Chicago's week of celebration into something none of them would forget. This is the story of the Super Bowl blizzard of 1979. Please subscribe, your support means everything to us. On Friday, January 12th, the morning routine played out like it always did. Coffee makers gurgled in kitchens. Car engines turned over with reluctant effort in the cold. Radio stations delivered the weather between songs. A winter storm system moving in from the northwest, they said. Wind gusts would pick up. Snow would fall. By tomorrow night or Sunday, it could get heavy. At O'Hare International Airport, the operations team kept one eye on the sky. Flights were running on schedule. Planes came and went like clockwork. No need to cancel anything yet. The storm system was still hours away. At home, people began their evening routines. Some threw extra logs in the fireplace. Others checked their heating. Chicago knew winter. The city had survived worse, they thought. Tom, a postal worker from northwest Chicago, had decided Friday afternoon to get his storm supplies early. Milk, bread, batteries. He'd watched the news that morning and something in the meteorologist's voice had registered. Not panic, just attention. It was a habit that had kept him and his family safe through dozens of cold snaps. He'd fill the car with gas before the rush. Better to be ready than caught off guard. By evening, the wind had started to pick up, not aggressively yet, just a whisper, a reminder. The temperature was dropping, already down to the teens, but the snow hadn't begun. Not really. A few flurries here and there, dancing under streetlights. Chicago waited. By midnight on Friday, the snow began. At first, it fell straight down, 1 inch per hour, then 2. The wind picked up around 1 a.m. on Saturday, coming from the northwest in hard gusts that shook windows and bent utility lines. The flakes stopped falling gently and started driving sideways. Visibility collapsed. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was here. By 3 a.m., the first reports came in of stranded motorists on Lakeshore Drive. Cars had abandoned the highways. People sat in their vehicles, engines running, heaters pushing back against the cold, waiting for help that would take hours to arrive. The storm had turned the city's main arteries into frozen parking lots. By dawn on Saturday morning, Chicago had received almost 8 inches of snow. Streets that should have been plowed and passable were still untouched. The snow had come so fast that the city's fleet of plows couldn't keep up. The trucks themselves were getting stuck, their drivers navigating by guesswork and memory. Visibility reduced to just a few feet ahead. By noon, the schools made the announcement, closed. The courts suspended proceedings. The Transit Authority, the CTA, began cutting service. The elevated trains, the L, started to fail. Frozen switches north of Wilson Avenue halted the trains mid-line. The buses, meanwhile, crawled through the snow at walking pace, falling hours behind schedule. Thousands of people who depended on those buses to get to work, to get home, to get anywhere, found themselves stranded at bus stops. Shivering, waiting, power lines began to fail under the weight of snow and ice. Blocks across the North Shore went dark. Not everywhere, not yet, but the system was beginning to strain. One neighborhood lost heat for 2 hours. Another lost power entirely as a transformer blew under the burden. The water company reported frozen mains beginning to crack. By 4 p.m., Midway Airport announced that it was closing completely. All flights grounded. Within hours, O'Hare followed. The runways were too iced, the wind too violent. Planes that had been scheduled to arrive sat in other cities, their passengers diverted, their crews held up indefinitely. By late Saturday, O'Hare had been closed for 18 hours, with no clear timeline for reopening. It wasn't just inconvenience anymore. It was crisis. Sarah, a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, had gotten to work before the storm had really taken hold. She was scheduled for a double shift. Another nurse had called in sick that morning before the storm severity became clear. By Saturday afternoon, Sarah realized she wasn't going home. The buses weren't running. Her car was buried under 1.5 feet of snow in the hospital parking garage. She was staying. Along with hundreds of other hospital staff, she'd sleep in the break room, work extra hours, keep the city's medical system running while the snow piled higher outside. Food supplies began to run short. Grocery stores that had been busy all week reported shelves emptied of milk, bread, and batteries by Saturday evening. The supply trucks couldn't navigate the roads. No deliveries were coming. What was on the shelves was what the city had to work with. By Saturday night, the official snow accumulation stood at nearly 18 inches. The peak was still coming. Sunday, January 14th, began like a whisper and ended like a scream. By morning, the snow had stopped. But the drifts had begun. Where snow had been pushed by the wind, it piled up in walls 8, 10, 12 feet high. Entire cars were buried. Small houses had snow drifted halfway up their first-floor windows. The thermometer read 12 degrees, but the wind chill made it feel like 20, 30, 40 below zero. The city's Department of Streets and Sanitation estimated it had removed over 100,000 tons of snow by Sunday morning, but the streets still weren't passable. The snow removal vehicles were getting stuck themselves. The system was breaking. By noon, the total snow depth on the ground stood at 29 inches. The forecast models had called for 2 to 4 inches. Emergency rooms filled with people suffering from frostbite and hypothermia. The fire department's phone lines jammed with calls from people stranded in cars, in homes without heat, in apartments where pipes had frozen and burst. One call came from an elderly woman who hadn't left her apartment in 14 hours and whose furnace had died. A fire truck fought through the snow to reach her. They broke down her door and found her still awake, still conscious, but suffering from exposure. They wrapped her in blankets and carried her out into the white. At Cook County Hospital, emergency room physician Dr. Marcus started seeing a pattern. Young, seemingly healthy men coming in with chest pain, heart attacks. They'd been shoveling snow, he realized. The effort of trying to clear just their driveways was killing them. The cold, the exertion, the stress of being completely, utterly trapped. The human body couldn't sustain it. Michael Chen, a truck driver, had been trying to make it home from Gary, Indiana, all day Sunday. He'd abandoned his truck on I-80 around 2 p.m., figuring walking would be faster. It wasn't. He found a small gas station, still open, its lights visible through the snow, and tried to wait it out. The owner, an older man named Frank, had the heat running and a small space heater going. Michael was one of 6 stranded drivers and customers who spent that night in the gas station, rationing hot coffee and the few sandwiches Frank had left. They told stories. They watched the snow pile against the windows. No one talked about whether help would come. The wind gusts had been clocked at 39 miles per hour, but on street level, in the urban canyons of downtown, the snow seemed to move with different physics, swirling, stalling, then suddenly accelerating, carrying the cold in a way that made winter feel like a living thing. By Sunday evening, the mayor's office had declared a state of emergency. Governor James Thompson made it official, a disaster declaration for northern Illinois. The National Guard was being called in. It wasn't just the snow anymore. It was what the snow had broken. Monday morning came gray and terrible and necessary. The Guard arrived with heavy equipment, plows the size of buildings, chains for wheels, military logistics. But it wasn't the machines that the city would remember. It was what ordinary people did when the systems failed. They remember Maria, who lived in a converted brownstone in Lincoln Square, walking through the snow to check on her elderly neighbor, a woman she barely knew, had exchanged maybe 5 words with in the 3 years of living next to each other. She brought hot soup in a thermos. The neighbor's furnace had failed. Maria brought blankets. For 2 days, they stayed together, warming each other's apartments by staying together until the National Guard routed the streets enough to get a repair crew through. They remember the church on Madison and Spalding that opened its doors as a warming center. The priest, Father O'Brien, who hadn't seen some of those people in the pews in years, now served them coffee and sandwiches while they waited out the storm. A banker sat next to a homeless man who'd been sleeping in the shelter across the street. They didn't speak much. They just sat in the warm. They remember the improvised rescues. On Milwaukee Avenue, a family of 3, parents and an 8-year-old girl, had gotten stranded in their car at 6 p.m. Sunday. The car had enough gas for heat. They rationed it. By morning, the fuel gauge was barely moving, but the street had cleared enough that a neighbor, David, who'd been watching the window, saw the car. He went to the garage, got a rope, hooked to their car, and pulled them forward enough to get their tires free. The family drove home. David went back inside like it was the most normal thing in the world. They remember the bar owners who kept their doors open all night, not for profit but as shelters. The Shamrock Bar on North Avenue, the Bucket on Milwaukee, free coffee, free warmth, no questions asked. By Tuesday, the city had clawed its way back to something resembling function. The National Guard had cleared enough roads that emergency vehicles could move. The airports remained closed but would reopen. Food trucks were rolling again. The systems were struggling back to life. But something had changed in Chicago. Some people had died, at least 22 in Illinois, with most of them in Cook County. One man shoveling snow in his driveway on Monday morning, a man with a wife and 3 kids, suffered a heart attack. He survived for a week in the hospital before his heart gave out. Another man was killed when a snowplow driver, under enormous stress and working triple shifts, lost control and struck him. A development center resident, wandering confused into the weather, succumbed to hypothermia. The stories of death were quiet, one by one, but they accumulated like snow itself, a percentage loss, a statistical tragedy to most people who read about it. But to those who lost someone, it was absolute. Yet what they would talk about for decades was not the deaths. It was the kindness. People remember the humbling of it, the understanding that all the systems, the city services, the police, the snow removal, the power grid, the transportation network could fail completely, and what remained was just people. And people, it turned out, could be astonishing. Tom, the postal worker, helped free 6 cars trapped on his street. He'd organized the neighborhood, shovels and rope, a human chain, everyone taking turns trying to push cars free until their hands went numb in the cold, then going inside to warm up before coming back out to try again. Sarah, the nurse, worked 72 hours straight at Northwestern. When she finally went home on Tuesday afternoon, she cried. Her car was buried, the streets were barely passable, but she'd been part of keeping people alive. She thought about the elderly woman they'd brought in with exposure, how she'd recovered, how she'd gone home. That mattered more than sleep. Michael Chen stayed at the gas station helping Frank clear the lot in front with a shovel they found in the back. He offered to pay for everything. The coffee, the sandwiches. Frank refused. "You'll do the same for someone else someday," he said. Michael never forgot that. Years later, stranded by a different storm in a different city, he thought of Frank, and he stopped to help a family stuck on the highway. The blizzard of 1979 did something to Chicago's collective consciousness. It was the moment the city understood its own fragility. Mayor Michael Bilandic, who had been the first to declare the emergency, would pay a political price. The city's snow removal had been inadequate. The response had been slow to mobilize. In the Democratic primary election for mayor just 6 weeks later, Jane Byrne, a relatively unknown alderman and political operative, ran against him, using the blizzard as her central issue. The snow had exposed the incumbent's inability to manage crisis. Byrne won the primary. She went on to win the general election. Chicago would have its first woman mayor, elected partly on the strength of a winter storm and a promise to do better. The city's Department of Streets and Sanitation was overhauled. New equipment was purchased. Protocols changed. The idea was to never be caught like that again, understaffed, under-equipped, underprepared. Weather forecasting improved. The National Weather Service issued stronger, clearer warnings. The system that had so badly misjudged a light snow in 1979 learned to respect the models more, to err on the side of caution, to tell people the truth earlier. But the most lasting change was less institutional. Chicagoans remembered that when everything fails, what saves you is community. A person, a neighbor, a stranger who decides to help. The city never fully lost that lesson. Decades later, when other storms came, when other systems failed, there was always in the collective memory this story. The Super Bowl blizzard, when the city was buried in snow, and when people showed up for each other. There is a photograph taken by the Chicago Tribune on Monday, January 15, 1979. It shows North Avenue, completely silent. No cars, no people, just a white street, utterly still, with the L tracks visible overhead, empty. Everything has stopped. 47 years later, that photograph still hangs in some homes. It is a memory of the day the city froze solid. But people who live through it don't think of that photograph first. They think of their neighbor's face when they brought hot coffee. They think of a stranger pulling their car-free. They think of a bar where the owner didn't count the cups of coffee he poured. They think of warmth returned to the cold. Chicago had been tested, and Chicago had held. If you experienced the blizzard of 1979, or if you heard the story from someone who did, please share it in the comments. Those memories are the real history of that week. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel.